Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Clara Deck. I'm with the NOAA Climate Program Office. This webinar is part of our series highlighting research from fellows in the NOAA Climate and Global Change Postdoctoral Program, or C&GC program. This program is sponsored by NOAA's Climate Program Office and managed by UCAR's Cooperative Programs for the Advancement of Earth System Science. Today, we're lucky to have Katherine Siegel here with us to present research titled Wildfire in Working Landscapes, Causal Analysis of Relationships Between Land Management, Bioregimes, and Ecological Transformation in the Western U.S. Katherine is a current C&GC Fellow at the University of Colorado Boulder, using interdisciplinary methods to inform equitable and sustainable land management, emphasizing both social and environmental aspects of landscape. Katherine's current work aims to advance our understanding of the links between forest management, wildfire severity, and post-fire ecosystem functioning in the Western U.S. We will have time today at the end of the webinar for questions. Please use the question feature in GoToWebinar to enter them as we go along, or raise your hand during the question section and I will unmute your microphone at that time so you can ask your question directly. So without further ado, I'm going to hand it off to Katherine to start her talk. Thank you so much again for joining.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining my seminar today. And I really want to thank Clara and also Ginny for organizing this. I want to start my talk by just acknowledging that I'm joining you today from the traditional territory of the Ute, Cheyenne, and Arapaho peoples here in Boulder, Colorado. And now I'll get into my talk. So the image in the background of this slide, oh, sorry, I got distracted by the chat thing. Sorry. Oh no, I minimized it. Okay, the image in the background of this slide is from Wildcat Regional Park in Richmond, California. And it shows a working landscape. So in the background, there's hiking trails in the foreground. In the background are cattle grazing, and then far in the background there's woodlands at the edge of the ridgeline that are protecting the watersheds for nearby reservoirs. And this idea of working landscapes really motivates my research program overall. So these are landscapes that support biodiversity and also rely on that same biodiversity to provide goods and services to humans. So these are goods like food, fuel, water, fiber, and forest products. And this map here shows global land cover in 2019, where the peach color depicts croplands, pastures and rangelands are in yellow, and the forested areas are in dark green. And so here, croplands, pastures, and some of the forests would be classified as working landscapes, which are essential for both biodiversity and also for human well-being. And in much of the Western US, these working landscapes are made up of forests and rangelands. And a major issue facing these working landscapes is changing wildfire regimes. These are important stressors that are impacting these landscapes and their ability to both support biodiversity and also provide ecosystem services such as carbon storage, forage for livestock, and also water for watersheds that downstream cities depend on. So in this talk, sorry, I'm having trouble advancing this. Okay. In this talk, I'll talk about a couple of research questions. The first being, how does land management affect wildfire probability in forests and rangelands of the Western US? The second, come on, is how does land management affect wildfire severity? So first is about probability, the second is about severity. And the third, oops, sorry, is how do changing wildfire regimes impact forest composition and climate resistance? So thinking about how systems change after fire and what that means for how well adapted ecosystems are for climate change stressors like drought and wildfire. So, sorry, I'm having a little trouble with the mouse, but okay, there we go. Oh, too far. Sorry. Go back. First, oh my gosh, I'm so sorry. Okay, first I'm gonna talk about this first research question. How does land management affect wildfire probability in forests, as you can see on the left, and rangelands on the right? Okay, so this first project I'm gonna talk about, I worked with a team from UC Berkeley, where I did my PhD, and then also University of Wisconsin to look at how forest ownership in the Western US impacts wildfire probability. And as I probably don't need to share with all of you, we've been seeing big increases in wildfire activity across the Western US in recent decades, and this has consequences for human lives, property well-being, as well as for ecosystems and biodiversity. And in the literature, there's been a lot of discussion about the extent to which the recent increases in fire activity are attributable to two key factors: climate change and forest management. And so in this project, we looked at the impact of ownership versus the impact of climate variables on wildfire probability across the Western US. And in this landscape, the federal government owns 64% of forested land, while private owners own another 30%. And so in order to kind of simplify this question of the impact of management, we used land ownership as a proxy for management. And obviously this is kind of a coarse approach that doesn't capture all the nuances, but it does allow us to make comparisons at broad spatial scales. And so we compared federally owned and privately owned forests across the region. And why might we think there could be differences in wildfire activity on federal versus private land? There's a couple reasons. So first of all, different landowner classes have different objectives. Federal agencies might be tasked with conserving habitat for protected species like the northern spotted owl shown here, and supporting local recreation and timber industries, while private owners might be managing their forests to maximize economic opportunities or for non-commercial uses, all subject to local land use regulations. There's also different levels of biomass removal. There's evidence that publicly owned forests in the Western US have higher levels of biomass than private forests, because private forests have more commonly had periodic grazing or timber harvesting. So there's less fuel and also less fuel connectivity. And then finally, federal agencies have slowly begun to move away from their historic focus on fire suppression, beginning to recognize the ecological role of fire, while aggressive fire suppression remains the norm on private land, in part to protect economic interests. So in this project that I'm not going to go into a ton of detail on, but just kind of whet your appetite and talk about the kind of research I'm doing, we looked at whether there's a difference in the probability of wildfire on federally versus privately owned forests, whether this difference has changed over time in the last 3 decades, whether this difference or trends might vary by state, and finally, how the magnitude of the impact of management compares to the magnitude of climate variables, since we know that climate change is another major factor impacting increases in wildfire activity. And so my approach to this project, and also the next one I'll talk to you about, is using a toolkit from the field of econometrics in order to derive causal relationships from observational data. And this kind of suite of tools involves assembling a panel data set, which I'll talk about more in a minute, doing pre-regression matching, and then running mixed effects models. So panel data are longitudinal data that have repeated measurements of individual observations over time. And that allows us to kind of capture unobservable factors at the level of sample units. And so I first assembled a panel data set by sampling all forested points that are in federal land or privately owned across the Western US. And for each year from 1989 to 2016, gathering a bunch of data, whether it burned or not, different variables related to the probability of ignition of a fire, variables related to fuel aridity and fire behavior, etc. Then I used a tool called pre-regression matching to kind of take this big data set of observational data and establish kind of a treatment and control group that were relatively comparable, because as you can imagine, there's a lot of ecological, geographic, and kind of human-related diversity across the forests of the Western US. We have everything from temperate rainforests in Western Washington, as shown on the left, to roadside arid pinyon juniper woodlands in Utah, as shown on the right. And so pre-regression matching is a way of going into your data and essentially for each treatment point, finding a control point that is most similar to it in terms of the covariates that are determining both the probability of the point being in the treated or control group and also the probability of the outcome of interest occurring. So in this case, it burning. I then used mixed effects models that included interactions between the management type, the state, and the year in order to look at the effect of management over time and space on the probability of burning. And from there, I was able to calculate the predicted probability of burning in federal forests in red and private forests in blue for each year from 1989 to 2016. And here there are two patterns I want to point out and talk about a little bit more. First, we see that the federally owned forests are more likely to burn in every year over the time series than the private forests. And second, we see that both forest types are increasing in their burn probability over time. So I want to get into that a little bit. But first, just an aside, I want to note that increased fire probability is not necessarily harmful ecologically. In many parts of the Western US, we've seen more than 100 years of aggressive fire suppression that has disrupted fire regimes that had historically been driven by environmental factors and also extensive fire use by indigenous peoples. And so more frequent wildfires in some of these systems might actually be enhancing ecological functioning and resilience. And we didn't, in this project, looked at fire severity, which is an important metric for understanding ecological impacts. Okay, so why are we seeing this difference between federal and private forests in terms of wildfire probability in any given year? This gets back to the ideas I brought up when I was talking about why we might see this difference in the first place. So there are different legacies of fire suppression, also historic exclusion of fuel removing activities on federal land, depending on the agency in charge and the objectives for the forest, and also changing management goals with federal agencies slowly beginning to allow forests to burn more frequently. Second, why are we seeing this increase over time in both categories of forest management? So this could in part be due to the legacies of fire suppression. The further along we get in the time period, the longer it's been since the most recent fire for many of the sample points. And this could also be changing practices in both management types, such as a move away from fire suppression, or it could also reflect climate impacts that we weren't able to account for in our models, which included a bunch of different seasonal climate variables, but there might still be patterns that we weren't able to account for. When we looked at this pattern broken out by state, so here we have it for all the states, and then each of those individual panels is a different state. We see that the pattern holds for 8 of the 11 states where federally managed forests are burning more than private unprotected forests. But there are 3 states, Nevada, New Mexico, and Wyoming, where we have different patterns that I'm currently trying to untangle a little bit more in some follow-up work. Finally, we also compared the effect of the we compared the magnitude of the impact of federal management to the impact of a 1-unit change in all the climate variables that were included in the model using marginal effects calculations. And we found that in most states, the impact of federal management on wildfire probability was greater than that of a 1-unit change in most climate variables. And this graph here is showing the results for California. And here we have the average marginal effect of being federally managed and as opposed to being privately owned. And here is the impact of a 1-unit increase in summer maximum temperatures in Celsius. As you can see, federal management has a bigger impact, but it's really important to note that this method of calculating marginal effects allows us to identify the impact of different variables on the system's outcome, but only within the realm of the model. And so there could be really important nonlinearities of, say, a 3-degree increase in maximum summer temperatures, but this method doesn't allow us to estimate this effect. So takeaways from this manuscript or this project. First of all, a key finding is that in this particular social ecological system of forests in the Western US, management can have as large of an impact as some aspects of climate change. So when it comes to wildfires in the Western US, we're not simply at the mercy of climate change, and there are management things that can kind of mediate the effect of climate on wildfires. Second, if we want to project the potential future impacts of changing climate regimes on biodiversity, we're going to need to account for both climate change and management variables. And then finally, this methodological contribution of the econometric toolkit applied to a social ecological system could be used in other systems as well. Okay, so next I'm going to turn to rangelands and talk about how livestock grazing as a form of land management impacts wildfire probability in rangelands in California. And this is a project that I led with a group of cooperative extension folks in California, as well as some faculty members at UC Berkeley. And this was really motivated by recent destructive fires that happened in rangelands in California, especially the 2017 Tubbs and Thomas fires. Rangeland systems in California have experienced rapid population growth. So when we have these rangeland fires, they really do impact human lives and well-being. And these rangelands are complex social ecological systems comprised of multiple fire-adapted ecosystems like grasses, chaparral, and also oak woodlands. And then the people who live and work in them, like ranchers and residents of recent housing developments. And historically, these landscapes burned in lightning-nighted fires, and also indigenous people in California used fire as a tool to manage these ecosystems. And in response to the fires that have happened in rangelands in California and elsewhere, there's been a lot of interest in both academic literature and popular media in using grazing as a tool to mitigate the risk of large fires, as you can see from these headlines. And the intuition behind this is that grazing can reduce the accumulation and connectivity of fuels, as shown by experimental and observational studies. And so here I took a look at whether this pattern holds at large spatial scales, using a novel data set with spatially explicit information on livestock grazing in 7 counties in California. And in this research, we attempted to answer a couple of questions. The first being, does livestock grazing impact wildfire probability in California, kind of in general? And then second, does the impact vary by region and dominant vegetation type, looking at grasslands, shrublands, and then also forests. And we included forests in our analysis because even though most grazing on rangelands is happening in shrublands and grasslands, we're interested in seeing whether grazing impacts the probability of wildfires spreading into adjacent forests. So one key challenge in this research is that we often know where rangelands are from tools like remote sensing, where we can look at land cover types, but we don't necessarily know where grazing is actually occurring and at what level. So we don't know, we can figure out the land cover, but not necessarily the land use. And so to get data on this, the cooperative extension network that I partnered with, has these established relationships with ranchers across the state. And so we were able to survey ranchers in 3 regions of California, defined by county borders and also eco-provinces. And these regions are the North Bay, Central Valley and Foothills, and then the Central Coast. And so we surveyed the largest private property owners in each of these regions. And we ended up with data from 123 property owners covering over 1,200 square kilometers of land. And I used the same basic econometric toolkit for figuring out causal relationships as I presented to you in the first project I talked about, where we first assembled a panel data set of, talk about it here, a panel data set of grazing over, I think it was 2001 to 2017, and assembled a bunch of covariates related to both the probability of grazing occurring and wildfire probability. And then we matched our data set again in order to control for kind of unobserved differences between the grazed and ungrazed landscapes. And so I'll show you the results broken out by region and by land cover. And in these graphs, we have the predicted probability in a given year on the y-axis, and the x-axis is the animal units per year per grazed acre, which is a metric of kind of grazing intensity or stocking density. And it's on the x-axis, and as it increases, that indicates higher levels of grazing. And for each region, I cut off the predictions on the x-axis at the level of grazing that we actually observed in that region. So I'm not going to be showing you what we would predict would happen to wildfire probability if we were to increase grazing beyond what's seen in that region. So starting with the Central Coast, we see that across all three land cover types, as you increase grazing levels, we see a decrease in the predicted probability of burning. The same is true in the North Bay region, but then in the Central Valley and Foothills region, the pattern is more complicated. Over kind of the lower levels of grazing, we see an increase in probability of fires. But then as we further increase the level of grazing, the confidence intervals are really large, and these are not statistically significant trends. And so based on this project, we were definitely wondering why we see this different pattern in the Central Valley and Foothills region than we saw in the other two, and kind of contrary to the expectations from the literature and from kind of the intuition behind this project in the first place. And so this is the image of the Central Valley in California, for those who are not familiar with this landscape. And we think there's a couple reasons why we saw a different pattern here. The first is that there were relatively few fires overall in this system relative to the other two regions. And as you can see from this image, many properties, including grazed properties in this system, are in close proximity to intensive agriculture or urban developments rather than wildlands. So we think that there are really highly altered fire regimes here, where kind of the proximity to wildlands and the neighboring land covers of a rangeland system are going to be more important in dictating fire than grazing or other management practices on that particular parcel of land. You can imagine fires probably aren't starting and spreading coming from irrigated cropland, for example. So takeaways from this project, the first finding is that livestock grazing can reduce wildfire probability in some regions and some ecosystem types in California, but it's not kind of a uniform relationship across the entire state. In terms of biodiversity solutions, if the interest is in reducing fire probability, expanded grazing could be a tool for that, but it's important to note that there might be trade-offs with other biodiversity impacts. And then finally, this is a method for thinking about how to disentangle the effect of land use versus just land cover change in a social ecological system. So now I am going to touch on this question of how land management can affect wildfire severity. So I've talked to you about the impact of forest ownership on wildfire probability, but as I mentioned, frequency of fire isn't necessarily a metric of how harmful fires are ecologically. And fire severity is a more important metric for understanding the ecological impact of fires. And so, for example, on the right, there are these drawings of two forests after a fire. The top image was a low to moderate severity fire that didn't cause full-on tree mortality, while the bottom image is a high severity stand replacing fire that's going to have much larger ecological impact. And there's been some recent work that has kind of tried to tease apart the impact of land management on fire severity, particularly a couple of recent papers that have linked industrially managed private forests to higher fire severities. But these have been at regional scales, and they have not used causal inference methods, formal causal inference methods, in order to draw causal relationships. So in my current work, I'm trying to take a look at this across the Western US using these formal econometric causal inference methods. So first, I put together a data set of fires that burned across federal and private land in the Western US from 2000 to present. And here, just to give you a sense of what this looked like, I'm zooming in on fires that burned across these two land ownership types near Fort Collins, Colorado. And what we can do with this data, or what I'm currently doing with this data, is we can calculate the burn severity across the perimeters of these fires. So here, I've calculated the burn severity for the High Park fire in 2012, and darker colors indicate higher fire severity. And as you can see here, this fire burned across federal land and on the left and private land on the right. And so what I'm currently working on, zooming in here, is overlaying, oh, sorry, this is just zooming in to show you the pixels at the boundary of the federal and private land. And then I'm using a design called regression discontinuity design in order to look at the effect of the land ownership on the severity. So in this type of method, we separate observations into treatment and control groups based on spatial, temporal, or policy discontinuities. So here I'm using the boundary between burned areas in private and federal forests as the discontinuity. And we assume that the control and treated observations that are located really close to the treatment boundary have very similar unobservable variable values, which allows us to minimize emitted variable bias in our estimates of the effects of the land management. And so the difference in the estimates at the discontinuity represent the effect of the treatment. And I'm just in the beginning stages of this work, lots of methodological challenges to address, like forest type and also kind of checkerboard patterns of forest ownership, but just wanted to give a sense of what I'm working on now. And then the other work that I'm currently engaged in is thinking about how changing fire regimes impact forest composition and climate resistance. And so this work is really looking at how post-fire vegetation communities differ in terms of their composition, functional traits related to climate resistance, and then also ecosystem service provisioning. And this again gets back to this idea that following decades of fire suppression, we're seeing more high severity fires in the Western US. And as post-fire ecological trajectories depend on fire severity, management, climate, and environmental factors, in some cases, following high severity fires, we're seeing ecological transformations where the forest that was there before the fire isn't what comes back afterwards. And we see shifts, for example, from dense mixed conifer forests to shrublands or less dense forests. And in some cases, these systems might be better adapted to climate change conditions, such as increased drought and more severe wildfires, but they also might differ in their functioning and the services that they provide to people. So the work I'm doing right now, sorry, trying to advance the slides, addresses these questions about shifts in post-fire vegetation community, changes to climate resistance, and also ecosystem processes and services. And again, this is work that's very much in progress, and I'm also hoping to link it to differential impacts of environmental change on more socially vulnerable human communities. So I'm wondering, are more marginalized rural communities more exposed to these changes in ecosystem service production? And this, again, is work in progress, so I don't have results to show, but I can kind of walk through the process just to give people a sense of the types of data I'm using and the analyses. So to answer these questions, I'm using a data set of forest plots that have been surveyed over time through the US Forest Service Forest Inventory and Analysis Program. And I'm able to kind of overlay that onto land ownership to understand the different categories of land ownership that are happening, and also match plots, as I talked about in my previous work, across climate, geographic, and environmental covariates. Also, as I showed in the regression discontinuity design project, then calculating burn severity in order to understand the severity at which fires are burning and how that might be related to some of the characteristics of management and also climate and other environmental characteristics. Then using logistic regression to understand under what management conditions we're seeing ecological transitions following wildfires. Bringing in functional trait analysis to see what these ecological changes mean for ecosystem functioning. So I'm assembling a database of ecological functional trait data for all the tree species present in the forest inventory and analysis plots in the Western US, focusing on traits related to climate resistance. And then doing ecosystem service modeling to think about how these changes in species composition and functional trait diversity are impacting services that people benefit from, things like timber production, soil stabilization, above ground biomass and water yield, and comparing the pre and post fire vegetation community. And then finally overlaying that with social vulnerability index that I've calculated based on US Census data. And with that, I want to thank all the organizations that funded the work I presented today, both the work that's been completed and the ongoing work, which is largely supported by the NOAA Climate and Global Change Postdoctoral Fellowship. And thanks again for joining and giving me a chance to share some of what I've been working on and also my current work. And in my current work, I'm very interested in expanding my network of collaborators, so feel free to get in touch.
Thank you so much, Katherine. We already have some questions starting to trickle in, which we'll get to in a moment. I'm going to put Katherine's email into the chat here so that you may get in touch with her if you'd like. Great. So I will read the questions from this question feature. And I'll also add that this webinar will be shared, a recording of it will be shared on the NOAA CPO website. I can also put the link to that in the chat. That will be up in just a couple of days. So feel free to share that with your colleagues or friends or anyone who may be interested. So your first question, Katherine, has there been any research toward evaluating the role climate change may have had toward inducing environmental stressors on forest vegetation that in turn could be possibly leading to increased susceptibility to the geographical spreading of forest vegetation specific pathogens?
Yeah, so I'm not super familiar with forest pathogens, but I think there's definitely been work looking at how climate stressors are kind of facilitating their spread and particularly making trees more susceptible. So for example, in California with recent droughts, I think there has been some work showing that trees that are under drought stress are more susceptible to different pathogens that then, I mean, it's kind of a bunch of different feedbacks compiling on each other to lead to higher tree mortality. And trees that are stressed out are less resistant to wildfire and pathogens. So there's kind of, a lot of different factors that are increasing tree mortality in forests in the Western US.
Okay, great. Let me see. Okay, I think we have a hand raised. So if I can unmute John Marshall, if you can go ahead.
Yeah, and actually that I just put that question forward, and one of the reasons I put it forward towards you in your topic of your presentation was that it occurs to me that fire may play a role in making those areas more resilient to those stressors, to those pathogens, by having eliminated some of the source material for the pathogens to spread into prior to their movement, and in some way actually be sort of an inhibitor of that, and maybe playing a role for better resilience of the forest over the longer term.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. And kind of dovetailing with that, One consequence of the aggressive fire suppression that most forests in the Western US have been subject to over the last 100 years or so is that we have much denser forests. It used to be that kind of low severity, frequent wildfire would kind of clear out younger trees, and we had trees that were more evenly spaced apart, were bigger and more healthy because they weren't competing as much with this kind of like dense, overcrowded forest. And so, yeah, I think to your point, fire regimes that have not been kind of turbocharged by fire suppression and climate change can promote more resilient forests, where we end up with fewer trees, less dense forest, but the individuals are potentially healthier and more resilient to future climate change impacts.
And you think about severity of fires when pre-European settlement, when old growth forests were the predominant vegetation, the severity of those fires when they did hit were very small. But as fire suppression increased and allowed that vegetation to staircase up to the canopies, then you had incredibly huge, horrific firestorm, locally induced climate by the rage of the fire itself. And I think that in the Oregon area, in the Tillamook burn areas in the 1930s, we had some good cases of that, where the old growth trees were really literally being sucked up by the roots out of the ground by the force of the updrafts of the fires.
Yeah, it's a great point.
Okay, thank you. So we have another question for Katherine. Do you have data on what started the fire? Do fires start for different reasons on private versus federal forest land? For example, arson versus accidents, controlled burns, etc., that might explain part of the difference in the fire rates?
Yeah, that's a great question. So unfortunately, the kind of region-wide fire data set I was using, which is the Monitoring Trends in Burn Severity programs data, doesn't indicate the ignition type. There is like state level data. So at least in California, CAL FIRE keeps track of all the fires that burn, and they do include the ignition type. And I think some of the work that I showed from Dunn and Zald in Oregon also looked at ignition types when they were looking at fire severity across private versus federal land. And one of their findings was that a lot of fires that burn on federal land started on private land and then carried over into federal land. So that's something that's worth noting. And yeah, there's a lot of different, ignition sources. Lightning is like the main natural ignition source, and then there's a lot of kind of accidental anthropogenic fires that start. But I don't have analyses that I've done personally looking at how those might vary over different land management types, but I do think the Dunn and Zald work looks at that, and also Jennifer Balch has some work looking at kind of the landscape of anthropogenic ignitions in the Western US.
Great, thanks. I will wait just another moment to see if anyone else is going to enter a question, or again, go ahead and use the raise hand feature and you can ask your question directly. So I want to thank Katherine again. Thank you so much for joining this webinar series and giving this talk today on wildfire in working landscapes. Again, I put the link in the chat to the page on the CPO website where we will post the recording to this webinar, and feel free to share that. And on that note, I think that wraps it up for today's webinar. So thank you all for joining, and thank you, Katherine, again.
Thank you.